All those weaknesses, the contradictions in the social, economic situations in the Middle East, then yes, they appeared in all their magnitude with the beginning of the latest capitalist crisis in 2008. This crisis affected the Arab world, despite the fact that the Arab world is probably one of the less integrated parts of the world in the world economy. But it affected, remittances from immigrants, fell, for instance, in Egypt. Tourism declined. The revenues from the Suez Canal also fell. In Tunisia also, GDP, gross domestic product, decelerated. And the export of goods also fell with 25% in 2008 in Tunisia. All this actually fueled the increase of youth unemployment. And you have something in the Arab world which seems very paradoxical, is the more you study, the higher your education level, the less chance you have to find a job. The fields of Andalusia, or the north of Spain, where immigrant workers from Morocco collect strawberries or olives, is full of university graduates from Morocco. Linguists, mathematicians, biologists, you find them all, in the fields of Andalusia or Extremadura in Spain or in Italy. Can you find a worse, condemnation, of those regimes that, the best of the youth, has to force itself to exile, in the plantations in Italy or in Spain, to be able to survive and make their families survive back in the country. What added actually to the effects of the rise of youth unemployment in the Arab world was also the surge in food prices in 2008, 2009. Especially in Egypt, the scarcity of bread was an important factor in igniting a strike wave. A strike wave which actually was preparing the way for the 25th of January revolution. There was one perceptive Arab blogger who wrote about the situation in the area recently. He was directing his comments to Western Europe, to CIA, to all these European intelligence services. He said, it is not the Quran Western security experts should worry about. He was referring to the West obsession with Islamic terrorism. But he said, actually, Western security experts should purchase Das Kapital for Marx. They should read Marx to get a reality check. This means they should read Marx to understand actually what is happening in the Middle East. I think we often indicate, changes in the economic and social and political situation as one of the main explanations, the mainspring for the revolution in the Middle East. But there's one other aspect which is at least as important, although it is more elusive, it is less concrete, but it is deeply rooted, in the souls of the Arab masses, which is a question of dignity. Arab masses feel humiliated. When in Algeria, different youth uprisings appeared, the parliament took an initiative to invite 300 youth representatives to parliament to discuss about their problems. And yes, they raised the question of housing, of unemployment, of low wages. But the MPs and the government was surprised about one thing, which was repeated by every one of those 300 youth in Algerian parliament, which was the Arab word of horga. They said dignity. We want to be treated with dignity. We don't want to be humiliated by little chiefs, by policemen, by civil servants. We want respect by the bosses. We want respect also by these foreign, investors. And yes, in the last 10, 15, 20 years, this desire, this profound feeling of, we want respect, was partially channeled through Islamic fundamentalism. But Islamic fundamentalism was never and will never be able to give that respect. I think Islamic fundamentalism related to the history of Islamic culture can be compared to midnight in the day, and not midday. It's midnight in the day of Islamic culture. That's what Islamic fundamentalism represents. So capitalism broke in its weakest link, Tunisia. But it's interesting, when I recently met the Moroccan comrades, they said to me, Erik, if you would have asked us to establish a hit parade of the countries in the Arab world which would be most, ready to start a revolution, Tunisia will not have been at the top of it, but probably at the end of it, or not even in the hit parade. People in the Arab world laughed a bit with the Tunisians. Well, they're quiet people, they accept dictatorships, the working conditions are good, etc. Something similar, if you think about it, happened in Latin America. Venezuela, which is now identified with revolution and be a vanguard of the revolution in Latin America and the world. I think 20 years ago, nobody would have betted money, in Latin America for Venezuela being at the forefront of socialist revolution. So the first reaction of the regime in Tunisia and Egypt towards these explosions, social explosions, was repression, especially repression by the police forces. But very rapidly, they realized that repression could not stop the movement. If you have unemployed youth in Sidi Bouzid who are ready to kill themselves, as a protest action, how can you imagine that bullets, can stop such a movement? As soon as the barrier, of fear has been broken, I think everything is possible. When they realized that they tried to combine repression with some concessions, with promises of reform of the system. But this, instead of calming down, the movement, gave a new impetus to the movement, because it was a sign not of strength, not of control of the situation, but of weakness. And most of those concessions were considered, too little, too late, and especially when the regime started to make step backwards, the feeling grew amongst youth, workers, poor people that yes, maybe this time we can win. It's important to stress, I think, that indeed, yes, the movement started with the broad masses, especially with the youth, unemployed youth, but it was the working class who gave the decisive blow, as well in Tunisia, as well in Egypt, against the respective dictators. In Tunisia, you had the UGT, is the main and only union, which cannot be considered, as a classical yellow union, as a scab. The top of the union, sure, was completely subservient to the regime, but within the regional branches, the local sections of the union, in some federations, like the health workers or postal workers or education workers, different left currents were active. And in the evolution of the revolution in Tunisia, the UGTT, the local branches, the regional headquarters, played a very important role. The youth, peasants, poor people came at the headquarters of the UGTT to be protected, to organize, to meet. That's where they came to coordinate their actions with the workers. And a central role in the downfall of Ben Ali was played by the call by the UGTT leadership for a general strike. I remember that when the national leadership of UGTT called for a general strike, they added the following. Something that was an impossible condition in Tunisian situation. They said to the workers, you down your tools for a few hours, and you don't leave the factory, and you do not participate in the demonstrations. Which is, of course, completely unrealistic, in Tunisian revolutionary conditions. Also, when Ben Ali was overthrown, when he fled to Saudi Arabia, and also already in the weeks before his downfall, at local level and later at national level, there was a real power vacuum, power empty situation. And this was filled partially by the trade unions, by the UGTT, who still now, in some areas, in some villages, represent actually the only, authorities, only administration. In that process also, in other areas, regional and revolutionary committees were set up to replace the collapsing administration, and especially in the capital, Tunis, in the days after the downfall of Ben Ali, the police security services tried to provoke a situation of terror and fear in the streets by looting, attacking, invading the working class neighborhoods. And in reaction to that, the population organized, security services in the streets to protect their streets and the neighborhoods, which could have developed together with the regional revolutionary committees or the UGTT in, elements or the origins of future, workers' power in Tunisia. So the process has not stopped yet in Tunisia. I will say something more about that later. But Tunisia is a small country. The downfall of Mubarak in Egypt is something completely different. Yes, the revolution in Tunisia opened the way to the Arab Revolution, but Egypt is a very big country with 82 million inhabitants. Egypt is at the heart of the Arab world. Anything which happens in Egypt, has not only Arab consequences, but also international consequences. Cairo in particular is the biggest, city in Africa. It's a horrible city. But for most of the Arabs, it's also, the capital of culture. And more importantly, Cairo and especially Egypt has a huge proletariat. And the Egyptian Intifada, the Egyptian revolt, was prepared actually by a decade of movement. So the Egyptian revolution, just like the Tunisian revolution, did not fall out of a blue sky. In the last 10 years, we've seen movements in Egypt, mass demonstrations in solidarity with the second Intifada in Palestine. You have solidarity demonstrations, massive street actions against the war in Iraq. And comrades in Morocco told us that they were happily surprised at those demonstrations to hear songs, of the 50s and the 60s. The people were singing communist songs. The third important movement in the last 10 years in Egypt was the struggle for democracy, the democratic movement around Kifaya, saying enough is enough. But I think more importantly, the fourth movement was that all this culminated in a massive strike wave in Egypt. One professor in the American University of Cairo, who is an observer of history of the working class in Egypt, said that this strike wave in Egypt was the largest social movement Egypt has witnessed in over half a century. He said, 50 years, over half a century. He estimated over 1.2 million workers and their families have engaged in some form of action during the strike wave. That's 2006, 2007, 2008, from 2006 on, 1.2 million. So the day of rage on the 25th of January did not really fall from the sky. But even then, it was, the moment was a surprise for many activists. But not the fact that there would be a movement, finally, after 10 years of organizing, struggle, etc. A sympathizer of us was in Cairo in October last year, and he told us, look, the most optimistic of the activists say that Egyptian revolution will explode maybe within 2 years. It happened 3 months later. But the Day of Rage was organized. Contrary to what many bourgeois commentators say, had no center, and it was a diffuse movement. So the Day of Rage was organized by all those activists who have been involved, in all those movements in the last 10 years. And the Day of Rage and the repression against the Day of Rage unleashed, indeed, a revolutionary wave over Egypt, with a succession of Friday prayer mass meetings and mass demonstrations, pitched battles with the police. The police who was feared in Egypt, but also despised. Then you had the occupation of Tahrir Square. But more importantly, again in Egypt, just like in Tunisia, it was outbreak of a strike movement, sit-ins and occupations in the industrial areas who gave the decisive blow against Mubarak. If you compare the Tunisian revolution with the Egyptian revolution, you see a similar pattern. It was funny, because you were ordinary people at television, I remember in Belgium, when they've been following Tunisia, then they're seeing the same thing happen in Egypt. They're always predicting, well, now it's making concessions, tomorrow we'll have to leave. You know, people were saying that. Well, there's a pattern in revolutions which can be recognized or traced back to the first English revolution in the 17th century. The similar stages. English revolution in the 17th century. An explosion of the mass movement, followed by ineffective repression, promises of concessions and reform, split at the top, a new movement which fueled new splits and new concessions by the top, the entry of new layers in action, especially the working class, and then the final overthrow of the dictators. And here is an important lesson, I think, for Marxists. An important, theoretical question from the point of view of the permanent revolution is that the only really, democratic social class today in the Arab world is the working class. You have all these different bourgeois tendencies in Tunisia and Egypt. When they understood there was no way of escaping, the revolutionary wave, they tried to jump on the boat. Say, oh, look, I'm also a Democrat. The most famous and well-known and pathetic figure was El Baradei, who came back from, where does he live again? United States? Or no, in Europe, somewhere in Europe? Yeah, but I don't know where he lives. Somewhere in Switzerland? Or in you? No, so anyway, he came back to Egypt and saying, I'm your leader. Follow me. I remember scenes where he ran away to the Egyptian masters and said, oh no, you're not our leader. Who are you? You never criticized the regime. Where are your democratic credentials? So none of the bourgeois tendencies in the Arab world are really ready and capable to fight for bourgeois democracy. Another lesson is on the question of the state. All those states, apparatuses, all the security services, the police, the networks of informants, they seemed very powerful on paper. Especially in Egypt. In Egypt formerly had the biggest, most numerous state apparatus in relation to its population to any other country in the world. It was said that 1 in 8 Egyptians was part of the security apparatus in one way or another. There's police everywhere in uniform, but especially there's a police who has no uniforms, who's everywhere also. But this, which can appear as a very strong apparatus, at the same time is its weakness. It is an apparatus of 1.2 million informers, policemen, spies, security agents. When there's a mass movement, 1.2 million, yeah. When there's a mass movement, it gets much more easily affected by the virus of revolt. And the old loyalties, dissolve, they disappear. But more importantly, I think any security apparatus, any dictatorship can only survive to the extent that the masses are ready to tolerate it. It seems a very simple thing to state, but it is true. When the barrier of fear is broken, I think everything is possible. Especially just like in Egypt and Tunisia, we've seen a split in the state apparatus, more or less on the lines of the police on one side and the army on the other side. Yes, the Egyptian army, Tunisian army are capitalist armies. But in Egypt, the army is also the product of the colonial revolution. Those who were yesterday at the commission given by Francesco will understand it better. That the high officers, the generals, they are completely fused with imperialism, with the dictators, with the families of Mubarak. But amongst the lower officers, the non-commissioned officers, and especially the soldiers, they're much nearer to the people, but also they live still, on the idea that the Egyptian army is a nationalist army, is an army of Nasser. And it is said now, that in great part it's a myth, that the army was on the side of the people. Army was protecting the people in Tahrir Square. That the army general staff will never try, to provoke an Egyptian Tiananmen, a bloodbath on Tahrir Square. Robert Fisk, journalist for The Independent, very good war correspondent. He wrote down one of his diaries in The Independent. He said that when he was on Tahrir Square, when Tahrir Square was surrounded by tanks and by other armored vehicles, he said the rumor was going on that the General Staff had given the order to the armored battalion on Tahrir Square to attack the demonstrators in Tahrir Square. He describes the following. He said he saw all these officers, or non-commissioned officers, getting out of their tanks, at the head of the tanks, speaking with each other to the radio. Then they stopped the radio, took the handphone, they phoned to the families to ask for their agreement. For their agreement, to say, look, we are not going to obey this order. And Robert Fisk said, yes, this order was never put into practice, but it was given at a certain moment. It shows how a revolutionary movement is affecting the state apparatus. Not only a rift between the police and the army, but within the army itself, a horizontal rift. I think you've all seen these fantastic images in Cairo. It was, online, directly. The fight, the pitched battles with the police, I think was extremely impressive to see that. It really indicates how, the youth in particular had lost complete fear of the police and really throw themselves almost physically against the police. There's one photo I remember when you see a line of policemen and 2 or 3 youths getting near to the police and really jumping on the police. Which shows really, the courage, the Arab youth. I had a friend still have a friend in Brussels, and when we were seeing those images, but she is not political. But when she showed the street battle, she said, look, Erik, I think if this is possible in Cairo, I think everything is possible now in the world. Everything can change. And they're right, everything can change. American imperialism, European imperialism thought that those regimes would live forever. You all remember Hillary Clinton comments after the Day of Rage saying, well, is the assessment of the United States of America that Mubarak and the regime is a stable regime, etc. So now you have to watch out. Every time the United States says about a regime that it is stable, it's probably a regime which will fall in the next weeks. Yes, now beware of those countries. The United States qualify as very stable countries, because probably the countries will fall in the next weeks. But it is true that Mubarak was pushed away by the army officers and probably also by American imperialism to prevent the whole regime to collapse. I think another important aspect of the revolution of Egypt and Tunisia, that it was a secular movement. Not only was it a secular movement, but it cut across all religious divisions. I remember one of these photos where you see an old Coptic woman with a big cross on her belly, side by side with an Islamic woman with a veil like this, throwing stones at the police. On Tahrir Square, when the Christian Copts, which is the local Christian minority in Egypt, organized their religious activities, they were protected by the dissident youth of the Muslim Brotherhood. And each religion, everybody protected itself and their activities, and protected particularly from the provocation of the regime. We wanted to stir up, sectarian divisions. Also, I think a revolution brings out the best out of a human being. In Egypt, like in Tunisia, but more in Egypt, it's not easy. It's difficult for a woman alone to walk along on the street. It makes it, they're harassed by the men. It makes it very difficult to participate in public activity. Many reports indicated, first of all, that many women participated in the occupation of Tahrir Square and other demonstrations, but they were never sexually harassed. There was complete respect. Another aspect we have to underline is the reactionary role of the Muslim Brotherhood. First of all, the Muslim Brotherhood, the leadership, was completely opposed to the Day of Rage, just like the Communist Party in Egypt, saying that the Day of Rage coincided, not accidentally, with the day of the police. It was a celebration day for the police. Well, it was the day of the police. It was official day of celebration of the police. And Muslim Brotherhood and the Communist Party said, we cannot demonstrate that day. We must show respect for the police. So it is one institution, one Morocco, in Tunisia, which deserves no respect by the Egyptian mass, and it is the police. So the Muslim Brotherhood, not only played no leading role in the revolution, but it opposed itself to the beginning of the revolution. The Muslim Brotherhood leaders not only are pro-business, but they are business in Egypt. It is estimated 40%, 40, of businessmen are supporters of the Muslim Brotherhood. And the Muslim Brotherhood leadership was used by the regime in the middle of the revolution to get support amongst the masses and to stop the masses. This provoked a sharp rift in its own ranks between the leaders of the Muslim Brotherhood and then the youth wing, the youth cadres of the Muslim Brotherhood, and also the women wing of the Muslim Brotherhood, who was opposed to the conciliatory attitudes of the Muslim Brotherhood leaders. We correctly, long time ago, analyzed and understood the reactionary nature of the Muslim Brotherhood. It's incredible how many left groups in the world, and also in Egypt, could not see what we could see. Especially the Socialist Workers' Party and their international organization. They were giving democratic credentials to the leadership of the Muslim Brotherhood. And this revolutionary movement, like every revolutionary movement, is a great clarifier of ideas and positions. The things you can discuss before a revolution among small groups of activists become very clear within the movement, especially in a revolution. Another aspect was the perplexity the Egyptian and Tunisian revolution has produced amongst the jihadist Al-Qaeda networks. I read a report of people who follow all those jihadist websites and also following the forums of discussion between the people. Now, what came out of that report was the complete confusion by the jihadist sympathizers and activists. They could not understand what was happening. And they imagined, yes, that the only way to overthrow Ben Ali and Mubarak would have been by bombs or with a holy war. And there is a real questioning in the ranks of those jihadist networks. And it's probably no accident that since then there have been no actually, terrorist attack, in the Arab world by Al-Qaeda networks, with one exception in Morocco. But we'll tell more about that later. But another effect has been on the West, on Europe, and in the United States about the revolution. Since 9/11, since the attack on the Twin Towers in New York, American Western public opinion had been bombarded by anti-Islamic propaganda, presenting Arab masses as Islamic fanatics, all the Arab women completely oppressed, and who needed to be liberated, of course, by the American army or the armies of NATO, of their oppression. And again, another friend of mine.
How many friends?
I have many friends. After the Egyptian revolution, he discussed with me. And he for many years, he was convinced by this anti-Islamic propaganda. And he said to me, I think something which is quite widespread now. He said, Erik, I've always imagined that if the Arab masses would come into the street, it would have been men with long beards, and chanting religious slogans, Allah Akbar, etc., etc. And now I see at television, they're just like us. I think that's very important because it cut across a lot of the racist, propaganda in Europe, the anti-Islam feelings. The revolutions in Egypt and Tunisia exploded in a spontaneous way. But is this really true? Was it really a spontaneous movement? Gramsci Italian Marxist, in one of his writings said, there's nothing like pure spontaneity. There's nothing like pure spontaneity. Yes, it was a spontaneous development in the sense there's no big party or big organization who took the initiative for the revolution. We must be careful in repeating this, because there's some ideological propaganda behind that also, saying that revolutions do not need leaders, do not need organizations, and that the revolution in Tunisia and Egypt was just a middle-class affair of young, Twitters and Facebook fans organized in, diffuse networks. So I think this is not true. Those movements were prepared. They were prepared by the events, by all the things I described. Yes, there was no central leadership in the sense of one party, one union, one person, leading it or to take the initiative of it. And yes, Marxism has never pretended that revolutions cannot happen without a party. Revolutions can happen without a party. We've seen it now and we've seen it in the past. But the existence, the presence of a Marxist party in particular will make and can make the difference between victory or defeat of a movement. Like I explained, those revolutions in Tunisia and Egypt have been accompanied by strike movements of workers in the factories. Interesting is that those revolutions, when they succeeded in overthrowing Mubarak and Ben Ali, that there was no stop on the mass strikes. Actually, the revolutions were followed by more strikes, mass huelgas. I advise every comrade to reread or read Rosa Luxemburg's book on mass strike, which is very useful to understand the relationship between economic and political strikes, between a mass strike and the revolution. In this book, she says the following. She says, every great political mass action, after it has attained a political high point, breaks up into a mass of economic strikes. She continues, says, this applies not only to great mass strikes, but also to the revolution as a whole. She says, between political struggle and the economic struggle, there is the most complete reciprocal action. And she concludes, it is not as such the strikes who produce the revolution, but the revolution who leads to an upsurge of strikes. This is what we've seen in Tunisia and Egypt. In a recent article on internet this week, with the title, Revolutionary Ramadan in Egypt. Revolutionary Ramadan in Egypt. Saying as a spate of strikes has greeted the beginning of the holy month in Egypt. And this is very important aspect of, the so-called post-revolutionary period, if you want to. But the revolution has not finished yet. It has not stopped with the overthrow of the dictators. The revolutions are continuing in new stages, new phases. The euphoria which existed in Egypt and Tunisia has made place for concern, preoccupation. Even some layers disillusionment. These people say, well, things have not really changed like we wanted it to change. Of course, this does not plead against revolution. But it pleads for the continuation of the revolution. Revolution until victory. This feeling is especially the case with the vanguard of the movement. Yes, a mass vanguard, but still, only a layer of the masses who participated in the movements a few months ago. Marx, in his writings on the revolution on 1848 in France, discovered something similar. He said, in February 1848, it all looked like a nice revolution. Everybody agreed. Everything seemed easy. Just throw out the dictator and all of the demands will be won. And then, he says, in June, a few months later, starts the ugly revolution. He says the nasty revolution, when workers in particular start to realize things have not changed like we wanted, and those who seem to be our friends are not our friends, are our enemies. A similar stage in the revolution is present, I think, today in Egypt and Tunisia, and is fueling the struggle month in, month out. Like in Tunisia, after the fall of Ben Ali, a few weeks later the people asked, yeah, but we don't want this interim government. You're trying to cheat us, to fool us. We want the dissolution of the ruling party, the RCD. And the stupid ministers, who were thinking they could still fool the Tunisian masses, they said at a certain moment, oh no, this is not an RCD government, because we all left RCD yesterday. Then you've seen different, it pushed the movement forward every time, and demanding the dissolution of the State Security Service in Egypt and in Tunisia. Or just like in Tunisia, they're demanding the election for a constituent assembly. So the masses are coming back, realizing the revolution has not finished. And since the overthrow of both dictators, you've seen a permanent tug of war between the masses and the regime, and the leftovers of the regime. I think the revolutionary masses, who has overthrown Ben Ali and Mubarak, also want to overthrow the little Ben Alis and little Mubaraks in the ministries, in the councils, in the police, in the army, and especially at the workplace. So what do we see now is that there's a growing internal differentiation within the movement. And this must not surprise us. Neither, give us bad feelings, oh, the movement is divided, etc., etc. It's not united anymore as in the past. It's normal, it's an inevitable stage. Yes, the masses do not enter, I think, the revolution with a clear idea of what they will replace the existing regime with. They have no clear plan for social and political reconstruction after the dictatorship. Like we say, they know what they don't want, but they don't know what they really want. So the comprehension, the understanding of the masses of what is needed is obtained by what Trotsky called the method of successive approximations. This is what is leading to internal differentiation in the movement between a left wing and a right wing, to speak in very broad terms. And they will realize, like already a layer is realizing, that there is a complete incompatibility between their democratic demands and, the capitalist regime. So I want to say something about the revolution in the rest of the Arab world. The revolution spread to almost all the countries in the Arab world, including the Gulf countries. I think one of the most interesting development icons in the Gulf countries was the revolution in Bahrain, a small island, an island state, in front of Saudi Arabia, which, by the way, has strong left traditions and strong unions. It was presented, at certain moments, still presented as a religious conflict between Shiites and Sunnites, which is, of course, a lie, because the masses themselves in Bahrain insisted on the unity between Shiites and Sunnites. That again, just like in Tunisia and Egypt, this was a secular movement. It's nothing to do with God or the Quran. In a certain naivety, political naivety, they tried to repeat the same in Bahrain as in Tahrir Square and occupying the Pearl Square. Because, Tahrir Square is a symbol of the revolution in Egypt. But we have two criticisms to that tactic to be repeated. Because in the learning process of the Arab masses, they try to repeat that tactic, saying, well, this is the magic formula, how we can overthrow regimes. First of all, the tactic of occupying central squares is a passive strategy, a passive action. And secondly, more importantly, that it leaves out, the fundamental power structures in society, the state. They don't attack the state by doing it. But it's clear that Saudi Arabia, which is the main country in the Gulf, could not tolerate the continuation of a revolution near its borders. And they sent in, massive troops to repress bloodily the Bahrain revolution. Because their own police force was incapable to do it. It just was collapsing. And also, they tried to use Pakistani mercenaries, young unemployed kids of the slums of Karachi were sent over by plane to, they were given a uniform, a stick, and now you repress your brothers. The international, especially the Moroccan comrades, is in contact with left-wing people in the underground in Bahrain, and they said they really felt isolated at a certain moment. Because all eyes of international media was directed against Libya, on the rest of the Middle East, which of course is not an accident. But they were very happily, it was a real morale booster when they heard about the campaign of the Pakistani comrades against, Pakistani youth used as mercenaries in Bahrain. The articles the Pakistani comrades wrote were circulated in Bahrain, together with the photos of the demonstrations, with the big placards and banners. Libya, the uprising, the beginning of the uprising, was without any doubt a genuine revolutionary upsurge. But it was rapidly captured, especially the leadership of it, captured by imperialism. France and Britain saw an opportunity, especially France, for internal consumption, because Sarkozy was going down in the polls, and France was sharply criticized for its collaboration with the Tunisian regime in repressing the revolution. And they saw an opportunity there to give themselves a new credibility. So they intervened in United Nations with a resolution demanding the protection of the populations of Benghazi, of the bombing of Gaddafi, justifying a military intervention in the last 3 or 4 months. It's a clear case of what they call humanitarian imperialism. More clever military specialists said, look, you cannot win, your war objectives in Libya just with airplanes. Solamente con aviones, con aviación. If you want to win, if you want to overthrow Gaddafi, one mode or another, we have to go in with ground troops. But it's the last thing I think United States or France or Britain wants in actual conditions. The rebels, especially under the leadership of ex-Gaddafi ministers and generals, and especially also with imperialist support, don't seem to be capable, of serious military advance. And Gaddafi, 3 or 4 months later, is still in power. Sure, strongly weakened, but the military conflict, what the revolution has become now, is in a complete stalemate, impasse. Imperialists cannot win, they cannot go forward, and they cannot go backward. They cannot leave in actual conditions. So they're trying to get a new deal with Gaddafi. It's important to understand that the military intervention of imperialism in Libya was completely reactionary, not only in relation to the Libyan revolution, but an editor of the Financial Times said that the imperialist intervention in Libya was something like a firebreak against the extension of the Arab Revolution in the rest of the world, and especially a means to authorize actually the repression in Bahrain, and a way of saving, especially Saudi Arabia, from being infected by the virus of revolution. Saudi Arabia really plays the most reactionary role in this revolution. This is not the first time. At the time of the first Arab Revolution in the 50s and the 60s, the wave of Arab nationalism and Nasserism, Saudi Arabia was also used, as a counterweight to the influence of Nasser and Arab nationalism in the region. The arm of Saudi Arabia in the region now is reaching far and wide. Their strategic objective is to make sure that the revolutions fail. They also have, a geostrategic objective, to make sure there's no regime, turns against Saudi Arabia. For this, they use money, they use their intelligence network in the region, even are establishing a club of kings, to which they invited the King of Morocco and the King of Jordan. Also, despite the fact that Syria, is a historical enemy of Saudi Arabia, Saudi Arabia is not so fond of regime change in Syria. Also Saudi Arabia, just like Israel, was quite upset with the attitude of Obama. When Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton abandoned their support for Mubarak, there was a little wave of panic, in Riyadh and in Tel Aviv. It was expressed in different articles, in both media. It saying fundamentally, well, the United States of America should stand with its allies. Whatever happens, should stand with Mubarak. Especially in Saudi Arabia, they think, look, if Obama is ready to abandon Mubarak, maybe he's ready to abandon us also. And Saudi Arabia, the regime, is ready to defend its privileges. Be sure of that. I think a few years ago, one of those Saudi Arabia princes, there's many princes, thousands of princes, with a completely degenerated family and dynasty. You all remember, well, maybe not all, the series Dallas? You see the American series Dallas, Dynasty, etc., etc.? Only us, and some other people. But this, well, there's a new series starting, so we'll be happy or unhappy to see it again. But this, well, the degeneration of the Dallas dynasty family is nothing compared with the degeneration of the dynasty in Saudi Arabia. But one of these princes, a few years ago, gave a warning to the would-be reformers in Saudi Arabia. And he said very clearly, what has been won with a sword, lo que se ha ganado con la espada, will be defended with a sword. So Israel is also, affected by the Arab Revolution. First of all, its whole network, of Arab dictators which were protecting Israel collapsing. So we know that the Arab regimes, despite anti-Israeli rhetoric, are part of the defense circle around the Israeli Zionist state. There's an Arab saying, says the following: all revolutions start in Palestine but are aborted in the Arab capitals. The Palestinian masses, really understand the real role of the Arab leaders in supporting, Israel and the oppression of the Palestinians. And I think behind the scenes there must be a lot of discussion between Israel and Saudi Arabia, but how to oppose actually the revolution, how to make them fail. Plus also Israel is not very keen neither, just like Saudi Arabia, in regime change in Syria. Yes, there are enemies. Yes, there's great hostility between them. But in the last analysis, they rely on each other. The regime of Syria and that of Israel are each other's best enemies. Even someone says that they're like Siamese enemies. I think this is true. But the new phenomenon is what we've seen this week in Israel, with the revolutionary wave in the Arab world, in Spain, in Greece, also affecting, the Israeli workers and youth. So, in Syria, the last thing on Palestine, was also affected Hamas and Fatah in the occupied territories. I think all in your country, especially in Europe, when there's a solidarity demonstration with Palestine, all has the Hamas delegation and also Hezbollah delegation participating. And most of the left groups also capitulate towards Hamas and Hezbollah, pretending that they're the real expression of Arab and Palestinian resistance. No, Hamas and Fatah are part, of the same oppressors of the Arab masses. Interesting how in the beginning of the revolution, Al Jazeera published the so-called Palestine papers, were leaked by WikiLeaks, which revealed indeed the secret negotiation in Hamas and Fatah and the Israeli state, in which they're making concession after concession on the backs of the Palestinian masses. And also when the first stirrings of the Arab Revolution were felt in the occupied territories, in Gaza in particular, Hamas revealed again its ugly and oppressive face for those who want to see it, and repressed, the first demonstration in solidarity with the Arab Revolution. But what's happening in Israel is really confirming, our class analysis. And it contradicts in practice, not only in the writings of In Defense of Marxism or in our respective papers or websites, but in reality, it can be seen and understood by thousands of workers and youth, that all the strategies, the nationalist strategies, the opposing Arabs against Israelis, to see Israel as one reactionary bloc, that's completely wrong. Comrades, really, this is a very unique moment in the history of Israel. This is a very unique moment in the relationship between Israeli and Jewish masses and the Arab masses. This is also a unique moment for us, because we're the only ones who understood that, we have predicted that. We have also politically invested in this question. Ted Rand said, I think 20 or 30 years ago, they met leaders of the PLO. And Ted Rand explained our position. He said, against individual terrorism, against nationalism, the idea of mass uprising in the occupied territories by the Palestinian masses, trying to push a rift, on class lines in Israel amongst Israeli population, propose a joint movement of Palestinian workers and Israeli workers against their regimes. And Ted Rand was laughed at. They laughed at him, saying it's completely unrealistic. You do not understand the Arab world. You live in London. You don't live in Gaza. You don't live in Tel Aviv. So who was right? Who was right and who was wrong? The events show who was right and who was wrong. To conclude, comrades, the revolution has also affected Syria. The regime is fighting back in a very bloody way. But this is probably not a sign of strength, but a sign of weakness of the regime. So sooner or later, the Syrian dictatorship will also fall. Comrades, I think the revolution in the Arab world will not be, just like Alan said, a triumphal march. Non sarà una marcia triunfal, la rivoluzione nel mondo arabe. It will be a convulsive, a painful and protracted revolution. Now, it will take its time, 5 years, 10 years, difficult to predict. But in this period, there's no place for sentimentalism, for romantic views on the revolution. Then the masses will learn very rapidly, just like the vanguard is already learning now, that the democratic aspirations, the quest for freedom, end of oppression and exploitation, can only triumph with the workers taking power. There's one historian of the Arab world, a German historian, I forgot his name. He was commenting about the Arab revolutions. And he says, in the Arab world, the Renaissance, the French Revolution, and the Russian Revolution will all be telescoped. It's a German historian, I forgot his name. He's famous German, who nobody knows. I forgot his name. But here, in this formula, you find the essence of the permanent revolution. And this permanent revolution is back on the agenda in the Arab world. I think the Arab youth, Arab masses, have showed, just like their forefathers in the Paris Commune, that they're ready, they're disposed to storm heaven. It's an incredible, display of courage, by the Arab youth and masses. We must make sure that this courage, this sense of sacrifice, is matched, accompanied with a revolutionary strategy for socialist revolution in